So evaluations of causal claims reflect a trade-off between informativeness and compression. So I'll start with an introduction and a little bit of a informal introduction to what in the paper is a mathematically formal theoretical framework that we provide. So in science, we often represent data as generated by a causal structure. We see our world as causally structured, and you have mathematical frameworks for doing this by people like Judea Pearl and Spartiskly-Moore and Shyness, using Bayesian networks, right? So they use Bayesian networks, which are these directed graphs in which the nodes are random variables and the edges are meant to represent causal relations between those variables as this way of representing our world as causally structured, the data generating process as a causal structure. And that's been really fruitful in a lot of areas of science and also in philosophy of science for thinking about causation. And we posit, in keeping with some work by people like Alison Gopnik and Tom Griffiths and Tannenbaum, et cetera, that agents in everyday context, so just sort of ordinary people going about their lives, navigating the world, also represent their environments as generated by a causal structure. And a good way of modeling this process is, again, as a kind of mental Bayesian network representation of the environment that one finds themselves in. Now, attempts to model the causal structure of the world, whether you're doing it in science or you're doing it in just sort of your everyday life, to the extent that there is even really a distinction between those two things, they're subject to this variable choice problem. And the problem is that many variables can be used to represent the causal structure of the same data generating process to the same standard of empirical adequacy. And what that basically means is that you can choose some variables to sort of chunk up the world in different ways. You can fit a Bayesian network with those variables to your data. And then once you do that, depending on the variables you choose, you'll get different Bayesian networks. And there isn't sort of a further standard that you can appeal to say which of these Bayesian networks is sort of the right representation of the world, right? It's sort of the causal structure of the world is underdetermined by the data that you get once you've made a particular variable choice or another, right? And in particular, we hone in on two salient ways in which different variable sets can be used to represent the same data generating process. The first is what we call variable granularity. Basically, variables can be more fine-grained or coarse-grained, and I'll give some examples of how this works in a second. And the second way is that variables can be included or excluded in the model, right? So you can have a model that has some variables or doesn't have some variables, and you're going to get a different sort of causal structure relating those variables depending on whether you include or exclude variables in your model in the first place, right? And this is discussed throughout the philosophy of science literature insofar as it's a problem for causal inference in science. Jim Woodward in particular has a lot of great recent work on this variable choice problem, but we hold that the same problem applies in ordinary representations of the cognitive structure of one's environment. And there's some work on this in cognitive science. There's this paper in 2000 by Lian and Chang, some more recent work by Nai Vassil and colleagues coming out of Lombroso Lab as well, that tests some of the same things that we're going to be looking at today, but we're going to be doing this in a little more sort of unified way, thinking more generally about this variable choice problem and how we can sort of adjudicate between different variable choices in ordinary causal cognition. Right. So here's an illustration of this idea of sort of variable granularity, one of these dimensions along which variable choice sort of matters in causal representation. So suppose that I give you this data. So at least 70% of Brickyfly larvae, the Brickyfly is a made-up insect that you've never heard of before potentially, at least 70% of Brickyfly larvae kept in a warm, humid tank, they develop blue wings. 70% of the Brickyfly larvae kept in a warm, dry tank develop blue wings, and 1% of Brickyfly larvae kept in either a cold, humid tank or a cold, dry tank develop blue wings. So here clearly warm tank, higher probability of blue wings, whether it's humid or dry might make a difference, right? So here are two possible causal models that you might use. On the right here, we have this less compressed causal model in which we have a 4-valued variable with the potential values warm, humid, warm, dry, cold, humid, cold, dry. So this is a variable that's basically telling you both the temperature and the humidity or dryness of the tank, right? And that's a cause of the effect, which is this binary variable denoting whether or not the Brickyfly has blue wings. And you can use this causal model to infer the claim, raising a brickyfly larva in a warm, humid tank causes them to develop blue wings, once you also know some of the probabilistic information I gave you on the previous slide. Or you could go with this more compressed causal model, in which you just have a variable that just tells you whether the tank is warm or cold. You have an effect variable that says whether or not brickyfly develop blue wings. The claim you'd read off of this, given the probabilistic information I gave you on the previous slide, is just raising brickyfly larvae in a warm tank causes them to develop blue wings. So this is a more coarse-grained, more compressed claim. There's no mention of the humidity or dryness of the tank. Now, as for variable inclusion, I can give you very similar data. But here, instead of specifying whether the tank is humid or warm, I add this other condition, this sort of external condition to the tank, which says that if the brickyfly larvae are kept in a warm tank and sprayed with water, then they have at least a 70% chance of blue wings. If they're kept in a warm tank and blown with dry air, then it's just 70%. And 1% of brickyfly larvae kept in a cold tank develop blue wings, whether they're sprayed with water or blown with dry air. And here too, we can have two possible causal models. We can have this causal model on your right, which is going to use two causal variables, one that tells you the tank temperature, warm or cold, one which tells you the larva treatment, sprayed with water, blown with dry air, and they both sort of converge on this effect variable. Do the larvae develop blue wings? And you can read claims off of this, like raising brickyfly larvae in a warm tank and spraying them with water causes them to develop blue wings, right? Or you can just get rid of this variable that specifies how the larvae are treated. Just use take the tank temperature, say, is the tank warm or cold? Well, that's going to be a cause of a variable denoting whether or not the brickyfly develop blue wings, and you get the same causal claim as you did in the previous case. Raising a brickyfly larva in a warm tank causes them to develop blue wings, right? So what we argue in this paper is that optimizing both variable granularity and variable inclusion involves doing the very same thing. So telling you how many variables to include or how coarse or fine-grained those variables should be, that it comes down to maximizing the simplicity of your model while minimizing information loss, and we provide this measure of information loss. I won't go through all the math here. I'll just sort of focus on the sort of left-hand side of the equation, in which we just shows that our measure of information loss, it compares two graphs. So these are your G's here, G and G hat. Those are two different BayesNet representations of the system. The next two arguments, X and X hat, these are some variables that are changing between the two BayesNets. Y is an effect variable that's common to both BayesNets, and I is a distribution over possible interventions on the system. And what this equation gives us is just a measure of the amount of information that's lost in the move from this BayesNet G to the BayesNet G hat, where what's changing between them is these variables X and X hat, and where what we care about is the information that interventions give us about this effect variable Y, right? And so for variable granularity, you can say, well, the more information about an effect that's lost when replacing a causal variable with a more coarse-grained version of itself, the less optimal the resulting causal model is. So you want to be able to coarse-grain variables while not incurring too much information loss. Or you want to be able to remove variables from your causal model. This is the variable inclusion case, where you say, look, the more variable that a cause communicates about its effect that's lost when you remove background variables, again, where loss is measured by this equation, the less optimal the resulting causal model is, right? So that's our theoretical framework. Now let's think about this in terms of how we can test this in an experiment and what our results are. So we wanted to answer the following research questions. Does information loss predict differences in the perceived quality of compressed causal claims? So depending on how much information is lost according to our measure, do people give higher or lower evaluations of causal claims that are given from a particular causal model? And does information loss predict the perceived quality of causal claims across these two different ways of thinking about compressing a causal model, whether it's variable granularity or variable inclusion, coarse graining a causal variable, or taking causal models out of our BayesNet? So here's our study design. We recruited 450 participants via Prolific. We assigned them to a mode of compression. So again, either this variable granularity case or variable inclusion case. A vignette, we had vignettes about mushrooms, flies, or rocks. Flies are the ones I showed you before. And an amount of information loss inherent in compression, right? So a sort of measure of information loss could be higher or lower on our measure that I showed you, right? And each participant was shown one vignette, so sort of one of these conditions based on their assignment, right? So here's an example for someone assigned to the variable granularity condition. Suppose you're asked to briefly summarize the findings of a scientific report on the brickafly, a newly discovered type of insect. The report describes the outcomes of controlled experiments, and its precise findings are as follows. And this is going to look very similar to what I showed you before. So 70, 85, or 98% of brickafly larvae kept in a warm, humid tank developed blue wings. 70% kept in a warm, dry tank developed blue wings. 1% kept in a cold, humid tank developed blue wings. And 1% kept in a cold, dry tank developed blue wings, right? So whereas before we just said, well, it's 70% or greater, now we're saying here's these three possible percentages for the case where brickafly larvae are kept in a warm, humid tank, right? These data that participants were shown were then translated into three claims. The first is being kept in a warm tank causes brickafly to develop blue wings. This is our compressed claim because it makes no mention of the humidity or dryness of the tank. Then we have this high probability, more detailed claim, being kept in a warm, humid tank causes brickafly to develop blue wings. And then we have this low probability, more detailed claim, being kept in a warm, dry tank causes brickafly to develop blue wings. And again, just to remind you, in the data that we showed participants, the probability of blue wings, given that the brickafly were in a warm, humid tank, is always greater than or equal to the probability of blue wings, given that brickafly are in a warm, dry tank, and so thus our nomenclature of high and low. Participants were then asked to state how good it would be to include each of these three claims in a summary of the data that they're providing to a colleague on a scale from -3, very bad, to 3, very good. So there's this kind of communicative task that we're asking people to do here. So we varied relevant aspects of the stimuli. These are our sort of between participants manipulations. Recall this first data point given to participants. Either 70, 85, or 98% of brickafly larvae kept in a warm, humid tank develop blue wings. We picked one of these numbers for each participant. And depending on this number, you get an information loss amount on our measure of either zero information loss. This is the 70% case, right? Because then we're saying whether it's a warm, humid tank or warm, dry tank doesn't make a difference. So there's no information loss in going to this more compressed causal model. Or it could be 85% kept in a warm, humid tank, and then you get an information loss when you go to the compressed model of 0.03. Or it could be 98%, and then you get an amount of information loss when you go to the compressed model of 0.31. So you can see how there's a ratcheting up of information loss when you elide information about whether the tank is humid or dry, depending on this probability here. So we manipulate that between participants. We also varied whether the vignette was about mushrooms or rocks instead of insects. And we assigned some participants to the variable inclusion condition where we look at removing or adding variables from the model rather than coarse graining or refining a variable. And I actually have appendix slides where I show what the stimuli looked like in that case. So here are our results. So on the x-axis, you're going to have the amount of information loss for the vignette shown to a participant if they were to choose the more compressed causal claim. So the amount of information loss that's involved in compression is shown on the x-axis. On the y-axis, we have the mean evaluation of each of the causal claims. So this is the compressed causal claim, the more detailed high probability claim, and the more detailed low probability claim. And these are the results. So you see that when information loss is 0, so there's no information lost in endorsing a more compressed causal claim that elides the distinction between a humid tank and a dry tank, you see that people prefer the compressed causal claim in the zero information loss category to both the more detailed high conditional probability claim and the more detailed low conditional probability claim, which in this case are actually the same probability claim. So what we see here is that when no information is lost in compression, people like compressed causal claims. People like to avoid including more information. On the other hand, when you move to a moderate amount of information loss, so now this is 0.03, we see that people do prefer the high causal claim to the low causal claim, right? The low probability causal claim. So they want to include causes that raise the probability of their effects over ones that don't raise the probability of their effects as much. But there's no significant preference for the high probability, more detailed causal claim over the more compressed causal claim. So it seems that where information loss is moderate, people are treating causal claims that elide some information, that explicitly elide some information, as on a par with more detailed causal claims that include all the relevant information. Then we go up to a lot of information loss, 0.31. Here we see a robust preference for the more detailed, high conditional probability causal claim relative to both the compressed causal claim that excludes some detail and relative to the equally detailed causal claim in which the cause cited doesn't raise the probability of the effect as much, right? Now, we're interested in whether this gives a unifying account of both this sort of variable granularity and variable inclusion ways of compressing a causal model. And we find that, so here this is just going to be the same graph, x-axis, y-axis are the same, but now we're splitting them up by whether compression was achieved by coarsening a causal variable or by removing a background variable. And we find here that you basically get the same pattern across both of these cases. There's no interaction effect, no significant interaction effect, suggesting that yes, thinking about information loss does provide a unifying account of these two different kinds of decisions that we make and kinds of things that we have to consider when thinking about what makes for a good causal model of our environment. So to conclude very quickly, so these findings were replicated in a second pre-registered experiment that used different loss values and also changed a few other things about the order in which claims were shown to participants, suggesting some robustness there. And they're in keeping with this hypothesis that human choices as the variables used in causal representations are designed to maximize simplicity while minimizing information loss, and that these two things are traded off against each other. In some further studies that I'd be happy to discuss in Q&A, we found that this trade-off is moderated by the decision theoretic cost of the information that's lost in compressing the causal model. So where information is lost on our measure in a compressed causal model, but where the participant is put in a decision context such that that information loss is irrelevant to them, participants will happily lose that information, right? And so the trade-off only really starts once you get up to the point that there's a clear decision theoretic cost. So I'll stop there. Thank my collaborator, Tanya Lombroso, the University Center for Human Values that funds me, and Tanya can be a stand-in for sort of everyone in the lab who's helped me with this project. So thank you very much.
Other people, can I go? Yeah, great talk, David. So it sounds like in the other studies that you didn't go into detail with, you manipulated the decision cost, but another element here is the communication cost. So as you mentioned, this is a communication task. More complex models are more difficult to communicate. Have you thought at all about the role of that communication bottleneck in how people weight model complexity versus information loss?
So that's a great question. So the first thing to say is I think that like a lot of the reason why we build causal models of our environment is to communicate with one another. They're really good communication tools. And so in that sense, I'm happy to say that like what we're really measuring here is the sort of this preference for a causal model that is good for communicating about the causal structure of the environment. I think that's all fine. That said, in one of these studies that involves decision theoretic trade-offs, we also, rather than asking people to evaluate different causal claims to summarize some data for a peer, we actually just asked them to summarize the data in an open-ended way and coded them. And there too, we found similar trade-offs with information loss and simplicity, right? Where information lost was either zero or wasn't relevant, people in summarizing data actually gave summaries that did not include certain details, where the lack of inclusion of those details didn't lead to a significant amount of information loss. So we're not explicitly telling them communicate this data, we're just giving them the more open-ended summarize the data, and that's what they gave us. So.
Let's see if we have anything online.
We don't have questions right now.
All right. Well, I guess I can ask a question in the meantime. So I think this is like really cool work. Thank you. And here, so you're looking at what philosophers call type causation. So like general causation. So in general, is it the case that being raised in a warm tank cause bluebird flies or whatever to grow blue wings? But philosophers also sometimes talk about token causation, which is the more like, oh, so there was this particular fly and it was raised in a warm tank, and so to what extent was it the case that this particular fly was caused to get blue wings? And so do you think that the framework that you've been developing here applies only for the general type of causation, or could it also be extended to apply for like token causation?
Thanks. That's a great question. So the question is about whether everything we've presented here would apply to these sort of type level, sort of individual event causal relations. I think we have to be very careful, right? So the only literature I know on this, the only paper I know on this is Christos Beklavinidis has this paper coming out of David Lagnata's lab in 2017, where they looked at sort of token causal explanations and preferences for levels of detail, and actually found that people preferred explanations of token events that included details even where those details weren't relevant. So that's different from what we find here, which suggests that maybe the trade-off we're highlighting here is more specific to type level causation. I think type level causation is more important to this question of sort of how we model our environment, whereas token level causation is much more important to these questions of, explaining individual events, like the kind of causality that might be really important in like a legal context or whatever. So there might be just a difference there. In terms of our like information theoretic measure, in terms of Kullback-Leibler divergences between intervention distributions and marginals, which is ultimately what we're doing here, it's not immediately apparent to me that that can be sort of neatly plugged into the token case, because there you don't have so much of a, you'd have to think, in a real token case, you almost don't want to think about the counterfactuals as much as you just want to think about, or you certainly don't want to think about a probability distribution so much as you want to just think about the single case, what happened and what wouldn't have happened. So there are some tricky things in terms of importing that framework into that that model, both in terms of, does an information theoretic approach in terms of distributions even make sense? And secondly, there's some literature suggesting that things work differently in that context. But again, I'd be okay with that because we're interested really in this sort of how do we model our environment question. And there I think the type level framework is sort of the right framework because we're interested in repeatable events and sort of forward-looking causal prediction and causal modeling rather than backward-looking causal explanation.
Okay, we are out of time, but I would like to thank David again and thank you everyone who attended.